Hi guys, I'm Alex from Sanzu Fabrications. In this video, I'm going to show you how I made Ike's belt. This is another part in my Ike Cosplay series. So, without further ado, let's get into the video. I admit, Ike's belt drove me crazy. It seems like in every reference picture I found, pieces changed color, or materials would change, or in some cases entire seams would appear, reappear, or change color. There comes a point where you need to settle on a design, so I resolved not to stress out over the design by creating my own. I felt that if I kept enough of the main characteristics, the belt would still be identifiable. Before the smaller details though, I had to construct the main piece. When I did my original sizing for Ike, I was sure to pattern out the size and shape of the belt as well. I did this with the tried and true plastic wrap method. For anyone not yet familiar with the method, it's pretty much Kamui Cosplay's armor patterning technique. This calls for wrapping an area of the body, in this case Ike's waist, in plastic wrap, then covering the plastic wrap with masking tape, drawing on the seams or details, then cutting it off the model. I decided to transfer this model onto poster board for durability, but this is entirely optional. Also, remember that when you're patterning items for clothing, to add seam allowances. Since I had already used duck cloth for Ike's vest, I decided to use the same material for the belt. Although leather would have been more accurate, the duck cloth was easier to work with, and I liked the particular color. I traced the pattern for the larger side areas onto the cloth and cut it out. While it looks like Ike's comes together in the front, I decided mine would come together in the back. That way I could velcro the back shut and focus on making all the details in the front look good instead of worrying about them being functional. In some reference pictures, there's a simple raised area right before the center divide, but in other images it's a completely different color. I elected to use a separate gray material to add a little more variation to the look. I traced out the area that would be covered and added seam allowances before cutting them out. Now here's something to look out for. I didn't mark where I wanted the end of the gray area to be. I measured where I wanted the gray material to extend out to, then marked a full seam allowance inward. Next, I placed the gray fabric piece upside down, pointing away from its intended place. I then stitched over the edge. When I marked the area, I subtracted the seam allowance. But when I stitched the two pieces together, that same seam allowance was added back. Now, when I fold the fabric over and press it with my iron, it extends to the exact place I wanted it to. At this point, I rolled over the edges and hemmed them. Now it was time to join the two sides together. I originally planned to join the two sides of the belt together with a rectangle of brown suede, but I found the suede was far too flimsy on its own, so I added a backing of duck cloth. I cut the duck cloth at the exact size I needed the center panel to be, and the suede to be a little larger. This allowed me to fold the suede over the top and bottom edges before stitching them down. Next, I overlapped all three panels. The center panel went on the bottom, with the side panels on top. Since I didn't measure the center panel very accurately, I just used my original pattern as a guide. I pinned it all in place and sewed the pieces together. In the reference images, there's a large defined seam along the inside. I tried to accomplish this by doing a straight satin stitch along the sides. Honestly, I hated how it looked, but what's done is done. I think with everything else done, it doesn't look too terrible though. Next, I had to add the little straps across the center. I just cut a couple strips of duck cloth and hemmed them back. I then attached them to the belt by using the button setting on my sewing machine. Quick and easy. These little metal fasteners are actually scraps from when I made the clasps on Ike's vest. They're just squares of craft foam painted brown and then painted gold. They were glued onto the belt with a little bit of super tack. Now came the little gray pads on the side. I definitely took some artistic license with these. If you want something accurate to the reference pictures, You could glue some craft foam to the back of the gray fabric, then stitch around it, but I opted to make something more functional. I realized Ike had a lot of clothes, but no pockets. That's right, I added pockets to the belt instead of padding. This was just as simple as cutting out a pair of gray fabric squares, hemming them, and then stitching only the sides and the bottoms to the belt. We're almost done. This last bit of sewing was, yep, the belt loops. This wouldn't be very effective at holding up a belt without loops. Again, these were just 2 rectangles of duck cloth that I hemmed. I then folded over the top and bottom of the strips and sewed them onto the belt. Finally, I added a bit of Velcro to the back to hold everything closed. That's it. Ike's weight belt is officially done. While I did dress this up with a spare belt from around the house for a photo, I'll most likely find a cheap thrift store one that looks a bit more accurate. Thanks for watching. If you found this useful, be sure to like this video. And if you want to see more videos about this project, then consider subscribing.